My name is Bill Foster. I was born on Battery Point in 1932 at Queen Alexandra Hospital in Hampton Road. My parents lived at that stage in what was the Miller's Cottage down the lane opposite St George's Church. It was the original cottage that was lived in by the miller of the man in charge of the windmill that was right opposite the church. The mill has gone, but the cottage is still there. That must have been a little bit expensive for my parents because it wasn't all that long, probably a matter of weeks, and we moved from there down to another cottage in Colville Street. My mother told me many years later it was £1 a week cheaper to rent this other cottage in Colville rather than the Miller's Cottage. So in living there in Colville Street, I had started to have first memories of Battery Point, mainly of the cottage and the people living fairly near us. The little cottage there, number 5, is still there. All of those cottages, thankfully, have all been retained. And number 5 was only very small, 3 rooms, 2 on the ground floor. One became a living room, which was kitchen, and the heating supplied with a stove. The stove was fired by wood. The wood was always delivered by horse and cart, unloaded into the laneway and the footpath, and then carried in, stacked in the backyard, chopped, and then fed into the stove. The stove supplied all the heating, of course, to the house as well. The other front room there on the downstairs level was a bedroom for my parents, and upstairs was a slightly larger room with sloping ceilings, and that's where the children, as they grew older, would sleep, 2 or 3 sometimes upstairs. The little house was wonderful, except that it had no other facilities. There was no water or sink facilities. One tap just outside supplied all the water you needed to the house. The toilet was right in the back corner, as far away from the house as you could possibly get, and that was a reasonably well installed town supply of the sewerage. It hadn't all that long been connected to Hobart and the Battery Point area, the quality sewerage system. Prior to that, of course, it was always cans that were collected weekly. Now, it wasn't all that long living there at number 5, Colville Street, before we realised that next door at number 7 was a connection to the town gas supply. This made an incredible difference to my mother and her ability to look after the household and to look after the family. So we moved from number 5 next door into number 7. This was wonderful because with the gas she didn't have to fire up the stove and get everything going just to have a simple meal, particularly in the summertime. That was when winter time wasn't so bad because the stove would be running, it'd be hot, and it would not only heat the house, but it would also supply all the meals. Next door was the same, but you had the added advantage of having the gas connected to that one. Almost everything was the same. Toilet right in the back of the yard. Very simple. The only water supply was just one tap just out near the backyard on the corner of the house. So everything else was identical, still the same, still very small. The houses are still there and they're still identical, but they're still fascinating. It wasn't all that long. Probably I was 10, 12, and my grandfather passed away. Now, they lived very close. Dad's parents lived at number 3 Colville Street. And at number 3, it was a much larger house. It was built in 1900, whereas the ones that we were living in were built in the mid-1800s. So in 1900 that was built. You can tell that very easily because it's of the red brick style of construction, whereas the ones we were in, even though they were brick, were the handmade brick. You can see the mark through the brick signifying the handmade component. So the grandfather and grandmother lived in that house, and they had 2 or 3 of Dad's siblings living there with them. But they have slowly moved out. One, the youngest, Jean, sadly had tuberculosis. She passed away while they were living there. But probably when I was 10 or 11, grandfather Foster died. So grandmother didn't want to live in that larger house on her own. So we changed houses with her. So she moved into number 7. We moved into number 3. And it was like moving into a palace. It was just wonderful. So we spent the rest of our time there until I was ready to leave home, I guess. I'd be in my early 20s when we left there. The neighbours in that area were wonderful. I remember them very well. Still see some of them now. From when we lived in number 7, next door at number 9 were the Versackley family. Old Taz was a World War I veteran. It had an accident, had shrapnel lodged in the upper part of the head, and that caused a bit of confusion. He used to have epileptic type seizures. I remember clearly wanting to make a bow and arrow one day, and made one from a pussy willow branch. Thought I was so proud of it. Tied it all up and got an arrow. Managed to knock the head off the nail, drove it into the end of the actual arrow, and then if I fired it into soft wood, a growing tree or something like that, it would stick in there. So I was so proud I took it next door to show Taz, and Taz pulled the whole thing back that far that he had a slight seizure, put his finger over the end of the arrow, and the nail went into his finger, and poor old Taz just stood there blank and broke the bow and arrow into a dozen pieces, I think, and threw it over the roof of our house. In the meantime, I jumped through the fence and disappeared back into the house. Yeah, lovely, lovely memories. Anyhow, yeah, other people moved into number 7. Going back through down the street to number 5, the Harold family moved in there, and the Harolds were great. They were lovely people. Old Mick was a wharfie, as a lot of people in that area were at that time. Mick was a wharfie, and he had this lovely silver bike. He used to let me ride it because I didn't own a bike. We couldn't afford a bike. And this bike at that stage was just a bit too big for me, being fairly diminutive. And I'd have to put my legs through the bar and ride the thing sideways through the bar. Anyhow, he would lend it to me whenever I needed it, so he was very generous. And, yeah, very fond of memories of Mick. So that whole group, all on a fairly close triangle of the corner of Battery Point, all their back fences almost all met within that corner. So some of the fences were in good condition. Some of them were pretty damaged, so you were able to move fairly comfortably, or the kids moved fairly comfortably right through there. The difficult time for me as a child was trying to remember what it was like during the war years and during the Depression time. I don't remember much of the Depression. My dad worked on the road to the top of the mountain at that stage during the Depression. He was out of work. He was a skilled upholsterer, and he used to do a lot of repair work on chairs and lounge suites and so on. But being a youngster at that time, I have no real memory record of what it was like to live in those conditions.